Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, what I want to talk to you about today, there's so much going on in the world at the moment. You'll notice that things have been a little lax around here on the Exaggerated Elegy channel. That's because, frankly, I just haven't had the energy. Things have had to give lately. Things have just had to give. There's so much going on. Um, some of it in like my personal life and in terms of the work I'm doing is really good. Some of it, particularly on a global political perspective, is really, really, really fucking bad. And it has sapped a great deal of my energy, I'll be honest. Like a lot of people, I think, at the moment, it's very hard to get the energy to actually do anything. Um, it's very easy to fall into depression and despair. And I've certainly noticed that my old anxieties have been flaring up lately, and I'm feeling very, very, very drained right now, which is why you'll find it quite sparse around here at the moment. Don't worry, things will be back. I'll be getting back to a couple of video games, and I'll be getting back to, we'll be getting back to Not the Same Log and Hannibal Digested, just when we can settle everything and when we can coordinate, when everyone's got the energy to do it. But what really struck me today, it would have been Rick Mayall's 67th birthday today. Now, for those of you who don't know who Rick Mayall was, I mean, unless you were born sort of around the 60s or the 70s and you were young throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, then this probably won't mean much to you. And certainly if you aren't from the UK, this probably won't mean a great deal from you. He really came to prominence in the 1980s, Rick Mayall. He was part of this revolution that was happening in British comedy. Up until that point, British comedy was frankly asinine. It was bumbling, bumptious, conservative, largely incredibly racist, extremely dull, the and very prescribed. It was very, very prescribed. It was all about mocking the difference of others. It was all about reinforcing a certain very conservative norm of what it was to be British. There are exceptions, by the way. It's not universally the case. Obviously, you had the Pythons. And the Pythons, I mean, really, the Pythons are an example of what facilitated or precipitated the new wave in the 1980s, what came to be called the alternative comedy scene. Alternative comedy was largely defined by, first of all, the people involved in it. The people involved in alternative comedy tended to come from working class backgrounds. They tended to come from either the underclass or working class. They tended to come from universities or polytechnics that were not well regarded. And as they were incredibly anarchistic, they were very left wing, very counterculture, and they didn't do what you were supposed to do in comedy. They broke all the rules. They were crazy and surreal and strange. If you look at the Young Ones, which is really where Rick Mayall. It's where Rick Mayall came to prominence. He was only very young. Him and his partner Aid Edmondson, who'd been friends since university, he was incredibly young. He was literally a kid. He was like 19, 20 when the Young Ones hit the scene. And the Young Ones, it's no case of hyperbole to say, changed the face of British comedy. Suddenly, you had in like domestic living rooms this incredibly anarchistic, crazy, absurd comedy that didn't go anywhere, that had no logic to it, but was just surreal and strange and so off the wall that you couldn't help but laugh at it. That really characterized what came to be known as alternative comedy. I was too young to catch the Young Ones, except in reruns. It aired a lot on like on UK Gold and channels that tended to specialize in UK nostalgia and that kind of thing. And I never really saw it as a kid. It was much later on that I saw the Young Ones. I encountered Rick in other things. I encountered him in things like Jack and Ori, which was a British children's show where prominent actors, comedians, celebrities, etc., would read their favorite stories to children, and there was often animations and things that went with them. Rick Mayall did and I mean amazing read. He was a very good storyteller of George's Marvelous Medicine by Roald Dahl. Really, I mean, you can find it on YouTube if you type in Jack and Ori, George's Marvelous Medicine, you'll find it, and it's such a brilliant piece of work. He was a natural born storyteller, Rick Mayall. I also remember him from a children's show in the 1980s called Grim Tales. And Grim Tales was exactly what it said on the tin. It was Rick Mayall in this really strange, like patched together weird set, telling the grim fairy tales in his own very peculiar way. I mean, those of you who know Rick Mayall was a unique individual. He had such a way of comporting himself, such a strange sense of who he was. It was so overt and theatrical and fun. And he brought that to bear on Grim Tales. Again, go to YouTube, type in Grim Tales, and you'll see exactly what I mean. It's well worth a look, by the way. Grim Tales, it was ostensibly aimed at children, but it's really weird. There's some very odd animation and cutscenes, and Rick brings his humor to it. And that just makes it incredibly funny. Incredibly funny. But the thing that really did it, the thing that really entrenched Rick Mayall and his partner Ed Edmondson in my young mind, and in the the collective consciousness of most of us, was a late 1980s show called Bottom. And Bottom is genius. Bottom is one of the most consistently funny comedies Britain has ever produced. It still has that element of the alternative about it, but it's like the next step on from the young ones. The young ones is exactly what it says on the tin. It's that youth culture, it's verve, it's cool, it's weird, it's wacky. It's all the energy of the counterculture in a comedy form. Bottom is ostensibly those same characters. They're not, but they may as well be aged up a little bit to the point whereby all of their projects have failed, all of their friends have either sold out or moved on, and they haven't succeeded. They haven't succeeded in changing the world. So they are, as the title suggests, the down and out in Thatcherite Britain. It's a portrait of what it was like to have nothing in Thatcher's Britain. And it's married to Waiting for Godot. It's the weirdest thing. It is the weirdest thing. Uh, Aid and Rick had just come off of a production of Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett when they came up with the idea for Bottom. And when you watch Bottom, you can see Waiting for Godot in it. There's a similar energy to it. There's this sense of characters who have nothing and have nothing to look forward to, but are waiting for some ill-defined miracle to come and save them, and it never will. You know it never will. These two, the two characters, Richard, played by Rick, and Edward Elizabeth Hitler, played by Ade Edmondson. Yes, that is his name, Edward Elizabeth Hitler. They are the lowest of the low. They have nothing. They're unemployed. They're on the dole. They're in this shitty little flat, and they mutually despise one another, but they can't do without one another. They are essentially married in all but the the incidents that they don't sleep together. You know, they're effectively married. And it's about the complexity of that relationship. Now, don't get me wrong, the show is it luxuriates in crude, silly, toilet and slapstick humor. It luxuriates in it. It celebrates it, and it's very good at it. You will never, you. I mean, I love that stuff personally, and it may be because of the input of things like Bottom. I have such time for something that does stupid really well. And this show does stupid unlike anything else on earth. The slapstick humor, the violence, the incredible violence is essentially cartoon character. It's Daffy Duck, it's Bugs Bunny, it's Warner Brothers, it's Looney Tunes. Uh, but with the incidents that it's actually being conducted by live action actors. And they did all the stunts themselves. They did all of the pratfalls, all of the tumbles, all of the punches. And that's incredible. You would never get that now. Oh my God, the BBC would be terrified of doing that now. But they did the stunts themselves. And it's amazing. The timing and the trust between these two is unbelievable. And it is some of the best slapstick humor you will ever find. On top of that, you have this incredible sort of gross out counterculture cursing toilet humor that's really just saying it's kind of having a go at anything that believes itself to be too smart, you know? And it's kind of ironic in that regard. It is incredibly funny. It is incredibly funny, but underneath it, underneath it, you can feel the influence of Beckett, and you can see there is a certain intelligence going on here. There is a commentary. I mean, for one thing, the setting and the concept. It's a complete, I mean, it's an assault on Thatcherite Britain. The portrait of Britain that it paints is entirely contrary to everything the Thatcherite conservative propaganda wanted the world and Britain itself to think. The portrait of Britain it paints is as this is basically dystopian. Everyone's down and out. No one has any money. No one has any prospects. No one has anything. And all they're looking to do is find some mediocre distraction from the overwhelming misery of their lives. And that normally takes the form of drinking, violence, futile attempts at sex. I mean, the sexual politics of this show is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. I rewatched it recently and I was amazed at how progressive this show is. It is extremely male centric. It's about the experience of being a down and out heterosexual man, basically, in Thatcherite Britain. But the female characters, the women, by and large, are treated with all dignity. All of the comedy, all of the ridicule, all of the disgrace comes from the two leads. And you see that really emphasized in the first episode. In the first episode, they are, as always, on this relentless hunt for just for sex. That's all they really want. They don't want connection. They don't want intimacy. I mean that's the irony. That's again it's part of the intelligence of the show. Richie in particular, one of the big jokes of the show is that Richie is an eternal virgin. He is repulsive to women and to everyone basically. And the show is intelligent enough to understand that the reason he's repulsive is because he doesn't see women as people. He sees women as objects, and that's it. And also, he's entirely deluded. One of the ironies of the show is he could get what he wants. He could easily get what he wants and just have sex with somebody, and it wouldn't help him at all. It wouldn't help him at all. He's completely deluded in that regard. Richie doesn't have any identity. He's a narcissist. I mean, Richie is a narcissist as a result of like the traumas that he's faced. He has no identity, and throughout the course of the show, he's seeking after it. He often goes into these really abstract like soliloquies where he's not even talking to anyone. He's basically talking to himself. And he just tells these elaborate fantasies about how he's got aristocratic blood in him, or he's got the blood of this group or this demographic, or how he used to be in the army, or he used to do this, he used to be that. It's all bullshit. It's all complete bullshit because he's got no identity. And the show is so brilliant that it understands that. It understands that. It's why Eddie, even though Eddie is ostensibly in the same position, Eddie is a much more likable character because Eddie doesn't have those pretensions. Eddie actually knows exactly who he is and exactly where he is and what he wants. He's Eddie is it maybe this may have informed his name actually. Eddie is the id. Eddie only cares about drink, food, and sex, and sleeping. That's it. That's all he wants to make him happy. He doesn't want anything else, and that's all he'll ever want, and he is okay with that. Richie isn't. Richie feels as though he should be something more, as though he should be doing something more. And so he constantly sells himself to these prescribed narratives. Like he's a bigoted nationalist, Richie is. He often goes on rants about how Britain is the best at this, Britain is the best at that, despite the fact that in his situation, he is evidence of the fact of how terrible Thatcherite Britain was for everyone. It's brilliant. It is genuine. Brilliant. On top of that, in the first episode, you have this brilliant sexual politics where these two repulsive perverts essentially are trying to seduce quote unquote women and failing dramatically. Two of the women in that episode happen to be lesbians. And the show, I mean, this is the 1980s, this is the late 1980s. The mention of lesbianism, of homosexuality in mainstream comedies at that time was still considered a joke in and of itself. The word would cause people to laugh back at that time. And these two characters are treated with such incredible dignity. They are just normal people trying to get on with their evening while these two weird, crazy, inadequate men are swirling around them, trying in vain to seduce them. It's actually brilliant. I was shocked at how progressive the politics is, and it carries on like that. It carries on like that. In terms of the gender politics, the show is really complex. First, I mean, you have this whole thing where Richie and Eddie are effectively married to one another, with Richie being the put upon wife and Eddie being the drunk, delinquent husband. And they play those roles in various episodes and at various points. Richie is he has a notion of standards. He has this notion of propriety, despite the way he lives. It's really strange. So he will have a go at Eddie for going out and getting drunk, even though what else is he going to do? What else are either of them supposed to do? And Eddie plays into that role as the delinquent, abusive husband. It's really strange. It's really peculiar, and it actually opens doors for playing with the gender politics of the characters. At the end of the first episode, Eddie, in an altered state of mind, tries to seduce Richie. It's really interesting. There is this intimation all the way through of a kind of sexual fluidity between the two of them, despite the fact that they rampantly insist on their heterosexuality. And as any take it from a gay guy, guys, there is nothing more gay than someone insisting on how straight they are, because it is a case of the lady doth protesting too much, right? And that's what you get here. There are various episodes where they use various different pronouns for Richie. Characters will refer to Richie as she and as Eddie's wife. And it's so interesting. And even Eddie will do that. Eddie will do that at various intervals. It's really clever. The show is aware of its own incredibly complex, fluid gender politics. And bear in mind, this is a ridiculous, gross out, slapstick, kind of immature adolescent comedy in many ways. But underneath there is this incredible intelligence, and that's often what you get from the stuff that Aid and Richie were involved in. Whether that was conscious, I'm not even sure, but it's just there. It's layered in to the setting and the circumstances, and it works so well. I've been watching Bottom since I was like 8 years old, much too young for it, and it's still funny. I know the episodes inside out and it's still funny. And every time I watch it, I find something new. I find some new layer to appreciate in the show. It's brilliant. It is genuinely brilliant work. And I mean, Rick's death at the age of 57, for God's sake. I mean, so young was a real tragedy. I mean, a real tragedy. I would have loved to have seen what he and Aid would have been doing now. I imagine it would be very fun indeed. Um, but yeah. So, I mean, recommendations. The young ones, if you can find it, start with that. Um, Grim Tales, absolutely. George's Marvelous Medicine. The Jackanory George's Marvelous Medicine. Bottom, definitely. The New Statesman, Alan Bastard. When they parted company for just a brief period, Rick did a project apart from Aid, where he played a Tory MP called Alan Bastard, and it's incredibly politically acute. Let's put it that way. It really does spell out what the political position of the UK was back in the late 1980s, was throughout the 90s, and still is now, I can tell you. Oh my God. So yeah, Rick Mayall, a real loss, a real loss. Those of us who kind of had Rick in our childhoods, he became a figure that we just all knew. Everybody who was like a kid in the 80s and the 90s knew who Rick Mayall was because he was everywhere and he was brilliant. He also, I mean, this is really weird. In the UK in the 90s, he became the face of Nintendo. I know, really strange. Rick featured in various adverts for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Well worth looking at because they're really funny. They're really, really funny and well worth a look. Again, available on YouTube. Yeah, Bottom is the one though. The crowning jewel is definitely Bottom. It is the smartest of the shows that they did, and it's probably the most complete of the work they ever did. It's got so much going on in it, and it's just bloody funny. I mean, it still to this day has me in stitches. But it's with a note of sadness now. There is, because of Rick's death, there is that note of melancholia about it, which just makes it all the more profound.